to the top of the hour.
So I would, maybe talk for 30 minutes and then have some time for questions or something.
All right, sounds good.
Awesome.
This has been transferred with. If you ever need to adjust it into the CPU, you can do the slider there.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can. Oh, let me close the chat.
All right, so can you still see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right, well, thank you everyone for having me. Paul Spears. I work for a little company out of St. Louis called Oasis Digital Solutions. I'm the open source maintainer at Angular Bootcamp. And at work, I work on large, complex enterprise scale applications. And I provide consulting help for teams looking for advice on how to architect and scale their Angular app. And today I'm here to provide an introduction to ngRx. So I'm hoping that I can find a little bit of time to scrape together at the end of the talk to go over some code, but I'm actually going to spend a lot of time just focusing on ngRx as a library and as a pattern, and I'm going to very intentionally try and stay out of the code for as long as possible. And the reason for that is because there's just, technically there's a lot to learn with ngRx, and I want to set a nice firm foundation for why you care, and I really want to motivate the use of ngRx. Now, as I understand it, there's actually going to be a follow-up talk later on with a more advanced usage of ngRx, and so I'm kind of taking advantage of that to lay this groundwork today. So our goal, by the time we're done, is that we should be able to define and describe ngRx to our colleagues. And so ngRx, it's really, really popular right now. There's a lot of demand, and a large number of companies are looking for help adding ngRx to the mix. However, it's really powerful. It can act as a double-edged sword. So when introducing people to ngRx, I like to play it slow and make sure that they're really aware of what they're getting into. Now, lastly, I like to make sure that it's the right solution for their problem. And this can take some time to do properly. So we actually have a lot of ground to cover, and some of these topics are actually going to be brand new to front-end developers. So we got a lot to get through, so let's keep rolling. First, a little bit of history about the project itself. So it is an open source library, and it's not maintained by the Angular team. It is a collection of libraries, technically, and it was created by a man named Rob Wormald, and the first version of it shipped around December of 2015. And if you're keeping track at home, that's actually shipping before the very first release candidate of Angular 2. So from the very beginning, this was out tracking along with the release of Angular. And now, at the time, Rob was a core contributor to the Angular library itself. Since then, he's gone on to join the Angular team as a developer advocate, and he does a lot of work on their internal tooling as well. And when he joined the team, he actually handed over the management of ngRx to a couple guys named Brandon Roberts and Mike Ryan, and they continue to lead that effort today. And so, as far as third-party tools are concerned, this is really about as close as you can get to the Angular library itself without really being absorbed into the larger project. So on our quest to be able to describe and talk about ngRx with others, I want to start off by simply just defining what ngRx is. So on the left here, we have a couple of descriptions that I managed to find from the actual ngRx repo itself. And the first one is reactive extensions for Angular. So looking at this doesn't give us much help. It doesn't really tell us what we'd use ngRx for, and you're kind of left with this weird term of reactive extensions, and you have to ask them, what's a reactive extension, and why do I need one? Why do I care? Digging around deeper on the GitHub page, you find this other description, which is RxJS-powered state management for Angular applications inspired by Redux. So this description is a little bit better, but it also provides a bit more context as well. We now have a sense that, okay, this tool, we're going to be using it for state management, but it's still kind of cryptic. So I took the liberty of taking this description, rearranging it a little bit, and I added the word framework to my description on the right here to come up with the following. I call ngRx a Redux-inspired framework for managing state in Angular built on reactive extensions. Now, this description is no less cryptic than the other, but to me, this one does a little bit better job of kind of capturing all of the aspects of ngRx. So this fully describes it, but it's still really complex. So kind of the backbone, the framework of this talk is that we're going to take this phrase here, a Redux-inspired framework for managing state in Angular, built on reactive extensions, and we're going to pick it apart. We're going to dissect it, and we're going to look at each one of the key phrases and terms here to get a sense of the library. So the key phrases that we're looking at, first we're going to take a look at managing state, what it means to manage state, what kind of state you have in an Angular application, and why this requires an entire library to solve this problem. We're going to look at the word framework here. I added that for a reason, and that's because ngRx is more than just a single library. We're also going to take a look at what Redux means and what it brings to the architectural pattern that ngRx sits on top of. And then we're going to take a look at the reactive extensions that are used to kind of amplify the power that the Redux pattern is adding to this story. So back to our description. As promised, we're now going to talk about state. So what do we mean when we say state inside Angular? I'm going to use the definition that state is any data or user decision that changes during a single use of your application. So this can be data that's fetched from a server, a series of navigational steps taken by the user to get to a particular page. It could be form controls and the data that the user's typed in, or really any data that changes over time that you use in more than one spot in your app. So generally speaking, this state can fall into one of many different kinds of categories. So there's a large collection of categories. People have different definitions, different groupings for state in an application. But rather than going through them, just listing them off, I actually want to do a little bit of a demo. So heading over to another tab here, I created a simple little Angular application that shows examples of the various kinds of state that you might have in an Angular app. So starting off with the example on the left, it's called router state. This would be a good example of navigational state. The idea that your user, they're going to click and they're going to make choices about what kinds of things they want to use and interact with in your application. And that choice, that's a navigational one. They should be able to bookmark the app and come back to this particular spot that they've left. Now, in order to do that, they need to capture their navigation with some information in the URL. And also, that URL should be reflected in the application itself. That's an example of navigational state, where the user has gone, where they've navigated to in your app. The next example is form state. This is the idea that as you allow the user to interact with and enter information into that form, that information might be used elsewhere within the application. So in this example, we're collecting this user information and we're using it to create an address label. Maybe later this goes on to be used as part of a user profile. Either way, it's a way in which we've now captured data that's changed and we're using it in multiple spots. Next up is temporal state. This is the idea that even without user interaction, you could have data that changes over time. So here, for example, we have a list that represents the number of people who are currently logged in to a site. This is totally fake stuff. It's emulating the idea. But nevertheless, we have a list of people, and we use that information twice. We use it once to come up with the total number of people logged in, and then we have the actual list itself as it changes. So as this information changes, we need to make sure that that is updated in all the appropriate spots. Lastly, I've kind of grouped the rest of it into an example called service state example. And that's pretty much a stand-in for the rest of the kinds of state that you might normally have. So for example, we have a shopping cart. As I click on these products, we see that the count in my cart increases. I click on the cart, I see the content. I can click to delete items from that cart. And I go back and I see that that number was updated to reflect it. And so I need to be able to manage that shopping cart and do so in a way that as it's updated, as it changes over time, everyone receives that update and are able to respond to it accordingly. So at the end of the day, this is what ngRx is for. It is for taking these various approaches to managing state and combining it under a unified framework, a unified pattern for how we're going to solve these kinds of problems. So back to the slides. Why is managing state so hard? Well, as an application grows, a piece of state may be needed in more than one location. It's really tempting when you're first starting off to say, hey, I've got a shopping cart component. And as the user adds items to that, I'm going to save those items in that shopping cart. Well, oftentimes requirements, they change rather rapidly, and the next feature that comes out, you find yourself needing to use the information in that shopping cart in a completely different component, in a completely different location of your application. And so the next step in the application's development is to share the changes that occur to that cart across those components and possibly even the server. Now, when these situations arrive, it's the developer's responsibility to get that new answer, get that new state to all locations to make sure they arrive in the correct order. And meanwhile, the user is still using the app. They've provided many, many updates over time. And so getting the timing of it right, especially when considering asynchronous changes, is really kind of tough. So any custom-made, homegrown solution you might come up with to solve this problem, well, it's going to need to not only understand the kinds of changes, what kind of data changes, and why it might change. It also needs to be able to provide a solution that can scale across many, many screens, many routes, many features as your application grows, and also as your team changes. If you have 5 different approaches for managing the state of several different features and a new team member joins, they're going to be starting from scratch, learning how your application gets data from A to B with each new feature they come across. Also, as new features and UI requirements change, if you've not taken careful consideration as to how you're managing your state, you can very easily create a tight coupling between how you display a thing versus how the business rules allow you to change data, and being able to scale such a UI can be really difficult. And so whatever solution you come up with, you're going to have to pick and choose from some subset of these problems to tackle. And the idea with ngRx is that they're trying to solve all of these problems and all of these concerns with the collection of libraries that they've given us. And that's the idea behind the fact that this is a framework. So I was a bit hesitant to add the word framework to that description because there's a lot of baggage associated with that term. However, I couldn't come up with a more succinct way of describing this collection of tools. And so I picked the word framework because at the end of the day, it is a collection of libraries. It's a bunch of libraries that cooperate together for you to manage your state in your application. And you can mix and match them as you need. So let's take a look. This is going to be a very quick pass at all the libraries that ngRx has to offer. And after I've touched each one briefly here, we're going to narrow the scope back down, and we're just going to talk about one. And that one is ngRx Store. So most people, when they talk about ngRx, they will say, oh yes, I'm using ngRx. And what they really mean is I'm using ngRx/store. It is the first library that was created from ngRx, and it's what kicked everything off. This is the library that you're going to use to manage state in the most straightforward ways in your application. And all of the other libraries in this suite, they were built in support of this one. So all of the ideas and paradigms that we're going to be talking about all come from ngRx Store. Now, next up is effects. The idea behind effects is that not all state lives in the client. There's many kinds of features and state that live in your server or other external resources. So effects was created to support the effort that Store started by creating an easy way for you to synchronize state changes across not only your client-side app, but other sources of information as well. Router Store It combines navigational state with the store in the same way that effects combines and synchronizes external sources of change. That way, as your user navigates around, you can utilize router store to save that navigational change with the rest of the state inside your store. We've also produced some store dev tools, which allows you to do some debugging and actually visualize your state in your running application as it changes over time, unless you do a little bit of troubleshooting. Entity, this is one of their newer collections. It is used to manage collections of data that you store in your application. So for example, that shopping cart. If you need to perform a series of CRUD operations against such a list, Entity is a collection of helper functions that just help you manage that. It's probably the one that's tied least closely to store, and it can technically be used to change things outside of store. It's all about simply making it easier to deal with collections. And lastly, there's a little bit of boilerplate. ngRx is a bit boilerplate heavy, and so they've released some schematics that you can use with the CLI to help you generate out some of this code automatically. Now, again, we're going to narrow our scope back down to store. When I say ngRx, from here on out, I'm probably referring to just the store subset of ngRx. Okay, so here is a basic diagram that outlines the data flow and the update pattern that ngRx store is going to be applying to your application. Again, the whole idea here is that we want to turn over the management of our state to store and use its patterns and its paradigms in order to manage our application state. And so on our left, we have the entirety of our application code, with the exception of our state. We've pulled out our state and we said we want to give that to store to manage. And we're going to see a little bit more depth in the next few slides that the way that you must interact with your state now is through these approved channels, if you will. The idea is that store is going to be an abstraction that sits on top of your application state. And so you have to interact with it in a way that it allows. You have to interact with its APIs. And so when we want to get data out of the store, we need to ask for store for a particular piece of data. And we do so using what's a thing called a selector to identify what portion of the store of the application state we're interested in. And if we want to change something within the store, there's an approved way to do that in which we inform the store of our actions. Our user intent is conveyed through the creation and sending of actions to our store. So with our store now containing our application state, one of the most important ideas that comes along with that is that we also need to migrate the business rules or the logic that understands your problem domain of your application, that understands here is the problem I'm trying to solve with this app and how to manipulate the state of your application as the user interacts with your app. That logic needs to be moved into the store, into a thing called a reducer. And we'll see all about reducers and hear more about reducers a little bit later. But the idea is that these reducers, these are your business rules in the form of functions that know how to operate against the actions that occur in your application to update your application state. So we have this cyclical pattern of our application state is exposed to our application through selectors. User interaction occurs, which generates actions. Those actions are filtered through our business logic in the form of reducers. Those reducers produce new application state. That state is then reflected back into the application, and the process repeats. So this is a very opinionated approach. It has very particular ways in which ngRx allows you to access and update this information. So keep this in the back of your mind as we keep going here. So Up next, we've covered managing state. We know what state looks like in an Angular application, and we know that Redux is bringing a framework of tools to help us with it. And we've just touched on the very briefest of outlines of how it's proposing to do that. But before we can go any deeper into the how, we need to learn more about Redux. So first off, Redux, this is actually a library, and it is a completely separate library written in JavaScript for managing state, just like ngRx. And ngRx itself is a very opinionated library on how these developers should interact with the application state, but most of those opinions were actually inherited from Redux. So to understand why ngRx does the kinds of things it does to manage this state for you, we got to know a bit more about Redux. Now, I want to be clear, ngRx does not share any code with Redux. There's no need to install Redux, and they are completely independent libraries. ngRx simply borrows the well-proven ideas and patterns from Redux to shape how it's used. So, in particular, there are 3 principles from the Redux pattern, and from that you can derive 3 core concepts that apply directly to ngRx. So these 6 phrases I'm about to cover on the slide, they apply directly to ngRx the same as they do to Redux. And this is where it all started. Now, Redux, it is trying to apply a functional programming view of the world to state management in the client side. And so that's where most of these ideas stem from. I'm not going to try and defend the validity of these approaches or the ideas. I'm simply going to rehash what they are, and that will help us understand ngRx. So the 3 principles, single source of truth. This is the idea that if you have a piece of state in your application, it should be represented exactly once. If you have the problem where you have a shopping cart component and it maintains a list of the items that you've selected, and you have a shopping cart icon component that's supposed to show how many, if you have the shopping cart data maintained and tracked in both of those, it becomes a real challenge to make sure that as that cart is updated, you keep those pieces of information in sync. And so that is the heart of the problem that this principle is addressing. It's saying if you have state, it should be represented in a single place. And again, pulling from those functional programming roots, it says that state should be read-only. So it plays very heavily on immutability, the idea that your state should not be changed. It should only be updated and replaced. And then lastly, as part of this, changes are made with pure functions. Pure functions, if you're not familiar with them, it is the idea that it's a function that when executed, it has no side effects, meaning the only inputs are the parameters that you pass, and the only effect of running this is that the return value that you get is in fact returned, and nothing happens along the side. And so these functional patterns applied to state management help us to arrive at the following core concepts. And that is our state, in order for it to have a single source of truth, we're going to have to take our state and we're going to have to throw it in one JavaScript object. It's going to be one object, and we're going to use that to model our state. Now, in order to support these other ideas that it should be read-only, actions, we're going to use those to initiate change. We saw actions on the previous slide, and how if we want the store to update something, we got to request that it do that by giving it an action. And now this helps us to not have our hands directly in this state object. There's a formal pattern with which that we request changes be made. And then lastly, in order to make sure that changes are made with pure functions, we're going to use what are called reducers in order to produce our new state. So reducers, that's just a fancy word for function, but it happens to be a pure function that has these desired characteristics that we're looking for. It understands that given a particular action and given the state of my application, what do I need? What business rules do I apply to produce the next state of our application? So ultimately, we're creating a giant state machine to handle our application's transitional edges for their state. So we're going to revisit those core concepts right now again. And this time, though, we're going to map them back to this pattern that we see in this diagram. So we have our application state again, and the terms that we're going to see along the left, these are the exact same 6 statements that we saw on the previous slide. The idea that state is modeled using an object and that there's a single source of truth, we see that represented inside ngRx by the fact that our application state is an object that we store within the store. Anyone who wants to know about it, they have to go to that single store in order to get it. State is read-only. By utilizing these selectors and these actions, it provides us with a pattern for getting access to and providing updates to the store in a way that encourages that we only interact with it in a read-only way. Actions are used to initiate change. Well, that's exactly carried over one from the idea to the actual practice of utilizing ngRx. And finally, reducers are used to update the state, and changes are made with pure functions. We see that right here where the reducers come into play, reading the actions that occur, and looking at your application state to produce new state. So those 6 course concepts, I actually had scraped them directly from the Redux documentation. And here, overlaid with ngRx, we see that those actually have a direct correlation and a direct application within your ngRx applications. So all that said, here again, we're trying to manage this state management process. And these opinionated approaches, they have worked well for many different kinds of environments. And so we're now taking that Redux idea and applying it to our Angular app. Now, that last bit there, applying it to our Angular app, is the next phrase that we're going to talk about. So it might seem really obvious that, of course, this is, ngRx, it's, a thing for Angular, what more really needs to be said, but it does deserve a couple minutes of attention. So we just learned a bit about the Redux pattern for state management and how it largely influenced the design of ngRx, but actually in React, Redux is the de facto method of state management. It's actually possible to use Redux in an Angular application and skip ngRx entirely. However, ngRx was actually purpose-built to bring that Redux pattern into an Angular packaging. ngRx, it understands the shape of Angular apps and exposes its functionality through injectable services. It also understands Angular's lazy loading module system and can dynamically enhance the definition of your state object as the user uncovers more functionality interacting with your application. Lastly, it capitalizes on the fact that Angular is built on top of observables. And that actually brings us to the last key phrase here, which is reactive extensions. Before I move off to reactive extensions, I want to wrap up that last idea, which is while you could have used Redux directly in your Angular app, anytime you would have tried to apply that, you would essentially been reproducing the ideas that ngRx added on top of Redux to make it work well inside an Angular app. So rather than recreating that, ngRx store is simply providing that power for you. So reactive extensions. Now, this is more commonly referred to as RxJS, and it's a big topic. And so I'm barely going to scratch the surface of this topic. I'm simply going to explain how it's added to the mix. So RxJS, if you're not familiar with it, this is the library that brings us observables, and they're a great abstraction for representing asynchronous events and or streaming data, for example. And odds are, if you're writing an Angular app, you're already using RxJS. In fact, Angular requires that you install it as a pure dependency. And many of its APIs are already providing data in the form of observables. So for example, HTTP, that actually gives us back data in the form of observables. Now, in my opinion, this was a great move. Observables allow you to easily express really complex asynchronous data flows very succinctly and with very minimal code. And so the core concepts and principles that ngRx applies to state management this idea of I'm going to restrict the changes to your state and not allow you to modify it, but rather you must provide a new state each time. Well, if you think about that state changing over time, that fits the model of an event occurring over and over, or data changing again and again, which is right up the alley of what observables tries to provide us, a way of managing and understanding that something has changed. So rather than having to cobble on some sort of ad hoc solution of saying, okay, how do I know when my shopping cart has changed? How do I know when to go update everyone else and let them know that? We can utilize observables to watch the piece of the store that we're interested in and automatically respond to those changes. So it's really a really great natural fit to how Angular likes to do things. So going back to our diagram, we see here that, in fact, when we use selectors to ask for data from our application state, we actually get that back in the form of an observable. So we say, hey, store, here's a piece of state I want to look at, and it gives you back an observable that says, great, subscribe to this observable, and as the state of that, as that piece of state that you're interested in changes, I will send you an update each time. Okay, so that actually covers each one of the topics in our description here. And at this point, I want to stop. I think we're at the 30 minutes anyway. I want to stop and take some questions. And if there's a little time, I've got a little bit more we can talk about, but I want to see where we go with any kind of questions before I continue.
Okay, great, Paul. Let me figure out mic situation or something, or maybe people can ask and then I'll repeat the question. Does anybody who has a question about ngRx for Paul? Anything? Woo, don't be shy. You.
I see the slide where you have steps 1 through 6 of like stuff like states and object and states rebuilding.
Could you put back up the slide with the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with the state as an object?
Let's see here.
Oh, we're getting the mics turned down, so I couldn't remember which.
Thank you.
Perfect. Hang on, we're getting a mic set up.
Test.
Ooh.
Paul, can you hear me? Paul. Paul. Paul, can you hear me?
Very faintly.
Oh, faintly.
I don't want to blow out people's
Wait.
ears in here.
All right. See it. Oh yeah, because it's going through.
It's from those speakers to there. So.
Yeah, that's why. Oh, we. That. Ooh, that's not what I went to do.
You could have people line up by the computer.
Yeah. Wait, why did that happen?
actually would be like very neat and orderly, and probably the most effective way to get questions from Paul.
That's true. If anybody has any other questions, sorry, this is a little janky, but you
Sorry,
know.
I accidentally had the call dropped. I have the unfortunate keyboard layout that the PC's sleep button is right next to my volume button.
Oh, no worries.
So I missed whatever questions may have been asked.
I don't think we've had any yet. We were busy figuring out a microphone situation. Does anybody have any other thoughts, feelings? I've been learning ngRx and it's kind of a beast with like complex applications.
I do have a question. So you didn't talk much about where it's best.
Both?
Oh.
You didn't say much about where to use it and where not to use it.
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
So that is actually next up on my slide deck here. Share it again. All right, so yeah, again, I was trying to be respectful of time, so I wanted to make sure that we got any questions before I continued, but that leads us perfectly into kind of the pros and cons and where to use it and when not to use it, right? So the pros and cons, the short version of the story is that what you're dealing with here is that you're dealing with a large trade-off of you have to basically be buying into the Redux pattern, the Redux ideas for how to be writing your Angular application. And what that means for you is that you've got to be very comfortable or become very comfortable with the ideas of immutability, and you're going to need to become a little bit more comfortable with writing functional style programming than you would have been before. And so that introduces a bit of a steeper learning curve, and with ngRx, quite a bit of boilerplate. And that also means that everyone on your team has to be able to kind of get on board with that approach as well. On the flip side, what this does for you is that it unifies and presents this uniform approach to dealing with your state, regardless of what kind of problem you're trying to solve. So over here on my demo, how I had all of these different forms of state, ngRx is a perfectly suitable solution to all of these. Now, this is a tiny little toy example. And ngRx is really meant for large things. The trade-off of that boilerplate is really only worth it if you're dealing with something that is either a sufficiently large team of people, a sufficiently large scope, or a sufficiently complex collection of state interaction. And now, of course, all of these they have various different kinds of cutoffs depending upon what you're dealing with. But if your team is large enough that you're bringing in a large number of people or you have a high turnover, what you get when you bring in ngRx is the idea that no matter what feature I step into, I know to go find the piece of the store that represents this particular application feature, and I know to use selectors to get my data out of that store. If I need to make some sort of change to the data, I know I'm going to either use an existing or create a new action to change that store. And so if every team member comes in knowing that, you're going to have a lot of help in reducing the overall kind of ad hoc mess that can be created very easily with everyone kind of inventing their own way of dealing with the problem. If everyone knows they're using ngRx, you're going to have this uniform approach to solving your problem. That's going to be a lot easier for your teammates to become interchangeable across those features. Similarly, you could have a team of one, but you might have an application with 30 different screens or 100 different screens or 50 different features. And if you've implemented the same state management approach to every single one of those features or screens, it will be easier for you to come back and work on an old feature 4 months, 6 months later and know exactly where to look for how that problem was solved. If you've used actions to update the data and you've used reducers to encapsulate your business rules, it leaves you not needing to guess what kind of problems that what kind of approaches you took to solve those problems. And now there's one other really interesting place and where ngRx is a good fit. It's actually a really unique solution for if you have a team who wants to add observables to their toolbox, but they don't yet have a good handle on them. They just barely know how to use observables. They're just getting started. ngRx can actually be a really good fit for you as well. How this shapes up is that if you were not using ngRx, in order to get any kind of decent data flow out of your application will require you have a fairly good handle on how observables work. And if you add ngRx, a lot of the observability gets shifted into more of this, dispatch and action, run a pure function kind of data flow. But you still get an observable out the other end of that process. So you're still touching observables, but it's in a much more lightweight, less impactful way than if you were not to go and use ngRx. And so this is kind of a unique little slot where if you need to get a team up to speed quickly, you have a prototype, and you need them to be able to start upping their observable game, I would say take ngRx for a spin. Now, again, that's more like prototype level development. And after they've kind of got their their head around observables a bit more, I would look towards other possible solutions. So the flip side of that is, if I'm not using ngRx, then what else should I use? Turns out for most of these things, each of the examples I gave, there's a lot of good Angular APIs just in the box that you can take advantage of. But like I mentioned earlier, they require that you have a much better handle on observables than you might otherwise need with adding ngRx. And so you can utilize the router API, the reactive forms API of Angular, throw in a little bit of your own observable handling, and putting all of this data together with some custom data flows, and you can knock out a large majority of your Angular applications without even touching ngRx. However, again, going back to ngRx is a good fit for scale. It solves problems of scale more than it does anything else. So, and that's why I started all of this with the cautionary tale at the beginning, is that ngRx adds a lot of complexity, adds a lot of boilerplate, requires you to build on top of these very powerful patterns, but it could be a very, very big hammer to swing for a little bit too big of a hammer to swing for a lot of smaller Angular application problems. I know that was probably a bit of overkill for your question, but it's exactly what I had lined up to talk about next.
Yeah, that's great, Paul. I had one quick question for me. Have you looked at all at the ngRx data library that John Papa has been putting together yet? If so, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so we have this interesting problem where, and this actually ties directly into my cautionary tale. The direct short answer is that yes, I'm aware of that. There's also a thing out there called ngXS, and that's also coming on pretty strong. And these libraries, these are actually coming out of the fact that we've had a lot of people that have picked up and started using ngRx. A lot of people probably picked it up and started using it and didn't necessarily need it. And so they've been bitten by some of the complexity, some of the scale that ngRx introduces, and they wanted a better way to tackle these kinds of problems. And so the ngRx, actually I forget the name of it, John Papa's iteration at trying to solve the same problem, and then ngXS from Austin McDaniel. Both of these are kind of the next generation approach to solving these problems. Now, I've not used these because honestly, I think the next generation answer to this problem is in a different direction entirely. But I don't have that's a whole nother talk. It's literally another talk I've given.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting.
But yeah, I in my opinion, from what I've seen so far, it looks like if you have a sufficiently large problem to utilize something like ngRx, ngRx, ngXS, John Papa solution, all of these are probably going to be roughly the same in terms of how hard it is to pick up and use and take advantage of. If you have a simpler problem, then I would actually suggest not using any of those and just using the Angular APIs straight out of the box.
All right, great. Well, we should probably start wrapping up. Do you have any way for people to get in touch with you or get in touch with you for consulting or training or anything like that you want to share?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at DPS3. Our training is at angularbootcamp.com, and there's links from there back to our broader website, the oasisdigital.com website. One last thing, if you look for DPS3 on GitHub, you'll be able to find the code for each one of these steps, and that includes the same exact example in ngRx. And it's a pretty straightforward example of using kind of the most simple idiomatic use of ngRx. And so that is github.com/dps3/state management demo. So I'll put that in the chat. So Sam, you will have that, and I will let you redistribute that however you need to there.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Paul. We'll I'll get this video up soon, and yeah, we really appreciate your time.
You bet. Thank you.
Everybody say thanks to Paul. Yay! Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
I'll talk to you later.